In the previous video, observant viewers would have noticed the sudden appearance of the port and starboard lights on the superstructure. This was because of the third round of modifications that I was doing to the upper air defense platform. At the time I started working on the port and starboard lights, I had not expected to do yet another round of corrections to the upper air defense platform, and that got everything out of order. Now that I'm happy with the upper air defense platform, I can return to the planned schedule. So that is what I'll be doing in this video, constructing the port and starboard lights. Unfortunately, neither the Trumpeter kit nor the detail upgrade kit from FlyHawk came with port and starboard lights. This is quite an important detail and something that is easily noticed if missing. The first challenge was finding some decent plans for these port and starboard lights. The best plans that I could find to give an idea of the structure of these port and starboard lights are found in World of Warships. Essentially, I have copied the design in World of Warships as best as I can. Ideally, these lights would be constructed out of photo etch. Unfortunately, I don't have the right tools to cut sheets of metal, so it's difficult for me to build them out of photo etch. That means I have to settle for the second best option and build them out of styrene stock. The thinnest styrene stock that I have is 0.25mm, so I'll be constructing the lights out of that. To construct the curved corner of the lights, I'll use 2mm diameter styrene stock that I cut into quarters. This is something that would not be possible for me to do without the chopper. With the chopper, it's quite easy to do. It's just a matter of carefully positioning the blade so that it comes down on the center of the cylinder. Once that is set up, it's just a matter of making a few cuts, and I have a quarter of a cylinder. All of this I'm doing without specifically aiming for any particular dimensions. It's all being done visually. I start with the back plate of the lights. I'm using 1.5mm thick styrene stock. I can see from the image in World of Warships that the cylindrical portion needs to be slightly taller than that. So using the 1.5mm styrene stock as a guide, I cut the cylinder to the correct length. Once I'm happy with the size of the cylinder, I then need to cut out appropriately sized back plates. Once again, I'm just estimating the length visually. I loosely place the components on the superstructure and compare it to the image of this area of the ship from World of Warships. If the dimensions look correct, I'm saying it's good enough, and then I make a copy of that component for the other side of the ship. Once happy with the lengths of the backplate and the cylinder, they can now be glued together. I glue them together using Revell Contactor Professional, and then repeat for the other side of the ship, being careful to make a mirror image. Obviously they can't be exactly the same, otherwise when I try and install it on the other side of the ship, it will be backwards. While the glue is drying, I now need to measure out and build a frame that goes around the perimeter of the backplate. For this I'm using 0.5 by 0.25mm styrene stock. The bottom section is easy, I just repeat the cut that I made for the 1.5mm styrene stock, the backplate. But I have to adjust for the side and upper section since those are different lengths. Once the bottom section of the frame is cut, I glue it in place using Revell Contactor Professional. For the side of the frame, I need to make a small adjustment. In this case, it needs to be 1.5mm. I make that adjustment and then cut off two sections and glue them in place, also using Revell Contactor Professional. For the inner sections, I give up on using the chopper. It's not proving all that useful for such small cuts. I decide that it's easier to cut it with a blade, especially for these inner sections. It doesn't really matter if the edge isn't perfectly square. So I'll slowly cut down pieces until I get them to the right length and then glue them in place, also using Revell Contactor Professional. The upper edge of the back plate doesn't have a frame on it, so I leave that edge open. After the plastic cement has dried, these components are ready to be glued to the model. I'm going to glue them down before I paint them. I think it's going to be easier to paint them once they're installed. I glue the port and starboard lights in place using thick superglue because I want them to set in place pretty quickly. This would be difficult to glue down with extra thin plastic cement, which does set very quickly. It's difficult to hold it in the right position, and Revell Contactor Professional would take too long to dry. Thick superglue is a good in-between. It will give me time to position the light correctly, but it will also bond fairly fast. And if I need to accelerate the bonding, I can always use superglue accelerator. I also need to install a strut on the outer upper corner of the light. To find an appropriate piece of photo etch, I raided my photo etch stash. I came across this section of railing that is quite convenient. It has a sharp angle on these sections, so if I cut off around this corner, I can then use this as a nice strut. I think it's pretty good for the scale as well. Constructing this side of styrene stock would be far too big. After carefully preparing these sections of photo etch, I tacked the struts in place using extra thick superglue, and then reinforced the bonds using extra thin superglue. I think that's worked surprisingly well, so now I will paint them and see how they look. First I paint the entire light in XF53, the color of hood superstructure, and then wait for the paint to dry. Once the paint has dried, I paint the inner section of the port light in red, and the inner section of the starboard light in green. Once the green and red paint has dried, I see there is a little bit more touch-up that is required. I did get outside the lines a little bit. This is particularly noticeable on the top of the light and needs to be corrected, so I paint over the green and red paint with more XF53. And that completes the installation of the port and starboard lights. It would have been nicer if these were constructed with photo etch. The edges would have been more to scale, but I think this is a pretty good representation. It's certainly better than having nothing in this area of the ship. This area of the structure has been quite substantially modified from what was provided with the base Trumpeter kit and the FlyHawk detail upgrade kit. But it's still not done, and I will continue working in this area of the superstructure in the next video. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.